January 15, 1943, hills outside Salerno, Italy. The morning fog hung low over the olive groves, thick and damp. WWII's infantry squads moved cautiously along the ridge, their boots sinking into the frozen, muddy soil. The air was sharp with cold and the faint tang of smoke from distant artillery fire. Every man scanned the shadows, every sound amplified by tension. At the forefront, Private First Class James Mallory carried a long, cylindrical tube over his shoulder. His fellow soldiers glanced at it with skeptical eyes, some smirking. It was the new M1 Bazooka, freshly issued to his unit, and many considered it a novelty, a crude weapon that could never stop a real tank. "Looks like a toy," one corporal muttered. Jimmy ignored the words, adjusting the strap and steadying his grip. From the ridge below, German Panzer IVs and a few Panzer IIs rumbled into view. The officers leaned from their hatches, their laughter cutting through the fog. "Those Americans bring sticks to a fight," one sergeant jeered. "They can't touch our tanks." Their confidence was palpable, their mockery sharp. Jimmy and his squad crouched, eyes fixed on the advancing column. Every tank engine growled like a beast ready to devour anything in its path. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the soldiers could feel the raw power of the German armor. Yet Jimmy's hand remained steady on the bazooka. He had trained for this moment, envisioned it countless times, and he knew the weapon's potential. As the first tank neared, Jimmy raised the bazooka to his shoulder. He exhaled slowly, sighting along the crude iron sights, focusing on the flank of the Panzer. A sharp click, then the launcher recoiled slightly as the first rocket shot forward. It struck the side of the tank with deadly precision. Flames erupted, and the armored giant shuddered before coming to a halt. The German crews scrambled in panic, shouting orders that came too late. The soldiers who had mocked Jimmy's weapon now stared in disbelief. One rocket had stopped a tank in its tracks. Another followed, aimed at the second Panzer, and it too erupted in fire. The laughter on the enemy side faded, replaced by shock. Back in the German command tent, the reports arrived with increasing urgency. Entire armored columns had been halted by infantry carrying this seemingly simple weapon. What they had dismissed as a toy was proving to be a nightmare on wheels. Engineers immediately began considering countermeasures, but for the men facing it today, the bazooka was more than a weapon, it was survival. Jimmy fired again and again, each rocket finding its mark. Every tank disabled opened a path for his comrades to advance, saved lives, and turned the battlefield into something less hopeless. The laughter of the German officers had become disbelief, the confidence of the armored crews shaken. This was the first day the bazooka truly proved its value. From a mocked novelty to a weapon of devastating effect, it had earned its place in the hands of soldiers willing to take a risk, trust their training, and stand their ground. In those olive hills, amidst smoke, mud, and fire, a legend was born. January 15, 1943. The ridges outside Salerno had become a battlefield of smoke, mud, and fire. German armor and infantry moved cautiously now, the earlier confidence replaced by unease. Each panzer that halted under the fire of a bazooka slowed the advance of the German forces, giving American infantry the precious seconds they needed to reposition. Jimmy Mallory crouched behind a ruined stone wall, reloading his launcher. Around him, fellow soldiers moved with careful precision, advancing through craters and broken trees. The air smelled of gunpowder, burning fuel, and wet earth. Every man's nerves were taut, every sense alert. The enemy had begun to adapt, their movements calculated, but the Americans had learned quickly. From the ridge, a German officer shouted orders, gesturing frantically at the disabled tanks. The laughter was gone, replaced by a tense urgency. "They can't be this effective," he barked. "Check your flanks, don't let them get close." But every time a panzer tried to maneuver, another rocket found its target, igniting fuel and forcing the crew to abandon their vehicles. Jimmy spotted a tiger eye in the distance, its massive silhouette dominating the horizon. He knew it was too heavily armored for his bazooka, yet the smaller Panzer IIAs and IVs in front of it were all vulnerable. Each rocket he fired disabled a tank, cleared the path, and saved lives. Around him, men cheered quietly, aware that the tide of this small engagement had shifted. Infantrymen on both sides began to feel the psychological impact. German soldiers, once confident in their armor, hesitated. They looked at the American line with a mix of disbelief and fear, realizing that every inch of ground was contested, not just by guns and artillery, but by ordinary men carrying extraordinary weapons. Jimmy advanced cautiously, keeping low behind debris, his eyes scanning for movement. Another rocket fired, striking a Panzer IV and igniting it instantly. The blast threw smoke and flames into the air, illuminating the battlefield with a fiery glow. Soldiers froze in shock, the noise of the battle momentarily drowned out by the roaring fire of the burning tank. Amid the chaos, medics worked tirelessly, dragging the wounded to safety. The bazooka's effectiveness allowed infantry to regroup, recover, and continue their advance. What had been a terrifying armored charge just minutes before had become a slowed, disorganized retreat. The American soldiers had turned fear into opportunity, using the bazooka as both shield and sword. By late afternoon, the battlefield had changed. German officers scrambled to coordinate, issuing desperate orders to counter what they still called the toy weapon. Engineers began examining the wreckage, taking note of the damage and planning for their own anti-infantry measures. Meanwhile, Jimmy and his comrades moved forward steadily, each shot reinforcing the lesson that courage and ingenuity could overcome even the most fearsome obstacles. The day ended with American forces holding the high ground, their lines intact, and German morale shaken. Jimmy laid down his bazooka, chest heaving from exertion, and looked across the battlefield. Smoke still rose from the disabled tanks, the silence punctuated by distant artillery. The weapon once laughed at had proven itself, and the soldiers who wielded it had etched their names into the ongoing story of the war. January 16, 1943. Dawn broke over the ridges outside Salerno, painting the foggy battlefield in pale gold and gray. The previous day's chaos had left deep scars, craters, twisted metal, and the remnants of destroyed tanks littered the slopes. Yet for the American infantry, the worst had passed. They had seen firsthand what a small, well-placed weapon could achieve. Jimmy Mallory checked his bazooka once more, making sure it was ready. Around him, the unit prepared for another advance. German officers, now wary, had ordered more cautious movements, keeping their armor at a distance. Every tank disabled the day before had forced them to reconsider their tactics. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. As the Americans began their next push, a column of Panzer III and IV tanks attempted to flank their position through a muddy ravine. Jimmy took aim, heart pounding, hands steady. The first rocket struck true, halting the lead Panzer. Flames and smoke erupted, and the remaining tanks skidded in the thick mud, wheels spinning helplessly. German crews cursed, realizing that their armor could be stopped by something they had once dismissed as a toy. Infantry moved in behind Jimmy, exploiting the temporary paralysis of the enemy. Rifle fire and grenades kept the remaining Germans occupied while the bazooka destroyed vehicle after vehicle. Each successful shot not only killed a tank but inspired the men around Jimmy to push forward with renewed courage. The battlefield had shifted. Where once German armor had seemed invincible, now even a single rocket could turn the tide. By midday, the Americans had secured key ground along the ridge. Jimmy crouched behind a shattered wall, observing the retreating enemy. The bazooka had done more than just disable tanks, it had shattered confidence. German soldiers who had mocked its power now feared every American soldier who might carry one. Reports of the weapon's effectiveness were already reaching command channels, prompting discussions on countermeasures and new tactics. Meanwhile, Jimmy's squad moved from tank to tank, finishing what they could, ensuring no crew would regroup. Smoke curled into the sky, the smell of burning fuel and gunpowder heavy in the cold air. The terrain that had once seemed a trap for infantry now stood as a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the power of a single soldier's determination. As the day waned, German officers gathered, assessing the destruction. Their mockery of the bazooka had turned to disbelief, and disbelief would soon turn to urgency. Engineers and strategists began designing anti-bazooka tactics, including the Panzerschreck, a weapon directly inspired by what they had once laughed at. The Americans had won not only a tactical victory but also proven that innovation, bravery, and decisive action could overcome even the most formidable enemies. Jimmy looked out across the ridge one last time that day. Tanks smoldered in the mud, soldiers moved cautiously through the wreckage, and the battlefield was quiet except for distant artillery. The weapon in his hands had done what many had said was impossible. The M1 Bazooka, mocked and underestimated, had changed the fight forever. And the men who wielded it had changed history. January 17, 1943, the battlefield was quiet now, but tension still hung thick in the frosty air. American soldiers patrolled cautiously among the wreckage, eyes scanning for movement. Every destroyed tank, every halted advance, had left its mark, not just physically, but psychologically. The Germans who had once mocked the bazooka now avoided direct engagement, wary of the unpredictable, lethal threat it posed. Jimmy Mallory's squad moved forward, carefully clearing debris and checking on any survivors. The smell of burning fuel still lingered, and the twisted metal of destroyed panzers served as grim reminders of the previous 2 days. For the men on the American side, each shot fired from the bazooka had become more than just a tactical maneuver. It was a symbol of hope, courage, and ingenuity. The Germans had begun adapting, but the Americans stayed ahead. Infantry units learned to coordinate with bazooka teams, creating deadly combinations of mobility and firepower. Any panzer approaching too closely risked a well-aimed rocket, and the advantage that heavy armor once provided was slipping. German commanders grew frustrated as reports of bazooka kills piled up, forcing them to rethink both strategy and morale. In the distance, Jimmy spotted a small formation of Panzer IVs attempting to regroup. He signaled to his squad, heart racing. One by one, the rockets flew, finding their marks. Explosions echoed across the ridge, sending smoke and debris into the air. German crews abandoned their vehicles, fear replacing the confidence they had carried into battle just days before. Each tank destroyed reinforced the lesson. The weapon they had mocked could not be ignored. Back at the command post, American officers watched reports come in. The success of the bazooka had exceeded expectations. Not only had it saved countless infantry lives, but it had also disrupted German plans and slowed armored counterattacks. The battlefield dynamics had shifted permanently, showing that innovation and determination could level the playing field against superior machinery. By nightfall, Jimmy and his squad returned to a temporary camp, exhausted but alive. Around the campfires, soldiers shared stories of the day's successes, each tale punctuated by the roar of distant artillery. The M1 Bazooka, once laughed at, had become a legend among American infantry, a tool that turned fear into victory, doubt into hope. As Jimmy lay down to rest, he glanced at the bazooka beside him, the weapon that had made all the difference. He knew that tomorrow would bring new battles, new challenges, but the lessons learned over these 3 days would endure. Courage, precision, and ingenuity had proven that even the smallest tool, when wielded with skill and bravery, could reshape the course of history. January 18, 1943. The sun rose weakly over the Salerno ridges, casting long shadows across the scarred battlefield. Smoke still curled from the smoldering remains of German tanks, the ground churned and muddy from explosions and movement. American soldiers moved carefully, surveying the field, checking ammunition, and tending to the wounded. Among them, Jimmy Mallory carried his bazooka with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he held the key to survival. Reports of bazooka successes had spread rapidly. Word reached higher command that a single infantryman, armed with this small, rocket-propelled weapon, had stopped entire armored units in their tracks. German officers who had once laughed at the toy bazooka now issued urgent orders: adapt, counter, survive. The Panzerschreck, inspired by what they had dismissed, was already in development, a weapon born from humiliation and necessity. Jimmy and his squad pushed forward, encountering more resistance, but each time the bazooka made the difference. Tanks that had once seemed unstoppable were now vulnerable, and the confidence of the American infantry surged. The battlefield had changed, not just because of the firepower of the bazooka, but because soldiers now understood the power of precision, courage, and decisive action. As the day progressed, Jimmy paused atop a ridge, looking down at the devastated valley. He saw soldiers moving among wreckage, carrying the wounded, and securing abandoned German positions. Each destroyed tank, each successful maneuver, told the story of innovation triumphing over brute force. The bazooka had done more than kill machines, it had changed the psychology of warfare. Even years later, veterans would speak of those 3 days in Salerno. They remembered the small, portable American weapon that seemed crude at first, but proved devastating in skilled hands. They told stories of infantrymen like Jimmy Mallory, who, armed with courage and ingenuity, altered the course of engagements, turning what could have been despair into victory. The German armored divisions, forced to adapt, would never forget the humiliation of those lost Panzer III and IVs. The Panzerschreck emerged because of the bazooka, but the legacy of bravery and tactical innovation remained uniquely American. One soldier, one weapon, One moment of daring had shown the world that even underestimation could be overcome with skill and courage. As Jimmy looked across the battlefield one final time, the sun dipping low behind the ridges, he whispered softly, "Never underestimate the small, the weak. Sometimes they hold the power to change everything."